We're going to talk in this section a little bit more specifically about the axial skeleton. We're going to look at some selected components. We can see the axial skeleton outlined in red here. There are 28 total skull bones, and they're divided into these categories. 8 of them are cranial bones, which means that they surround the brain and have connections to each other to offer the brain protection and a place to reside. There are 14 facial bones that do come together to make up facial features. And then we have 6 ear ossicles. The ear ossicles are the 3 on either side, very tiny bones that reside inside of the temporal bone to work with our sense of hearing. We also have a hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is going to assist us with eating and moving our tongue and speech. The spinal or vertebral column consists of 26 bones, not just the bones that we might refer to as vertebrae, but there are some fused vertebrae at the end of the spinal column. So there are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then we have a sacrum that consists of 4 to 5 fused bones, these fused after birth, as well as a coccyx, and that was 3 to 5 fused bones. So all of those make up what we refer to as the spinal column. There is a sternum. The sternum is what we would commonly call someone's breastbone. And then we have 28 total bones that make up ribs. There are 12 pairs of ribs. There are 7 pairs of what are called true ribs, and true ribs are named such because of their connection to the sternum, which is different from the same connection that the false ribs have to the sternum. So there are 7 pairs of true ribs, 5 pairs of false ribs, and then 2 of those pairs of false ribs are going to have an even different connection to the sternum than the first 3 pairs. As far as cranial bones go, there are 8 bones in this category. The frontal bone is here. That would be what we might commonly call your forehead bone. You have 2 parietal bones. These are the bones on either the left or the right side of the cranium. You also have 2 temporal bones, one on the left and one on the right. There is an occipital bone in the back of your head. We have a sphenoid bone, and the sphenoid bone can partially be seen here in this picture. It does go clear through to the other side, and the sphenoid bone is a bone that we can actually see from a number of different views of the skull, depending on if we have taken the top part of the head off, if we're looking at it from the underside, if we're looking at it through the eyes, and then of course this is a good view of the side of the sphenoid bone here. And then we have an ethmoid bone, and the ethmoid bone is a little bit difficult to see in this picture. It's this purple area that is back here because the ethmoid bone is here. It does extend a little bit into the nasal cavity, and then it goes back up into this area behind the frontal bone. So the cranial bones surround the brain. If we look at the frontal bone in detail, we see that it does have a pretty good number of connections to other bones. It is connected to the zygomatic bone, it's connected to the temporal bone, to the nasal bones. So it makes up the top part of the roof of your eye orbits. The eye orbits are the holes or the cavities that your eyes reside in. So this is our frontal bone. Our temporal bone at the side of the head is best viewed from a lateral view, and it does form the sides, the lower sides of the cranium. It does have a hole in it. We looked at that earlier, the external auditory meatus, so this is where our sense of hearing would come from. So those ear ossicles that I mentioned would be found deep within this bone. The occipital bone. The occipital bone is the bone that is at the base of your skull, the very lower back part of the skull. It too has a giant hole in it. This was the foramen magnum, the large hole that the spinal cord goes through. The sphenoid bone here is shown in more detail and certainly more fully. This was the view we were looking at before, where we could see it from the lateral view, the side of the head. And we see here that it does go all the way from side to side. So this would be looking at it from the side of the head here, where I'm moving the mouse, and this is looking at it from the superior view. So this would be if you were standing looking down into someone's skull, And typically it's described as a bat-shaped bone. You can kind of see its wings here. It's called the keystone of the cranium. If we look at the way that it is sitting, it anchors all of the other bones of the cranium. The occipital bone attaches to it, the parietal bones, the frontal bone, the temporal bones. They all have a connection to the sphenoid bone. We have the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is that little bone that I said resided right behind your eyes and kind of went up into your forehead a little bit. The ethmoid bone can be seen from a number of different views. You could see it if you looked into someone's nasal cavity, because part of the nasal bone does divide the nasal cavity in two. You could see it by looking through the eyes, because some of the bone makes up the the medial socket walls. You could also see it from this same view that we looked at the sphenoid bone on. This is actually the ethmoid bone up here. So there are a number of different ways to locate and see the ethmoid bone. As far as facial bones go, there are 14 facial bones. A good number of them have 2 of each. The zygomatic bones are 2, lacrimal would be 2. We have nasal bones, 2 nasal bones that you see here that you can feel easily on yourself. You can also feel where those nasal bones end and cartilage begins. Here are the zygomatic bones in green, and the lacrimal bones in this teal color here. Those are very small bones that are just posterior to where your eyes would be. We have the maxilla here, and the maxilla may very well look like one bone, but it actually is fused together here. And so this is actually 2 bones that have a connection to one another. This is your upper jawbone. If we look inside of the nasal cavity, we see the inferior nasal conchae, those green bones here. Those are actually separate bones, even though they look very similar to the red parts in here. Those red parts are actually part of another bone, but the inferior nasal concha make up their own bone. They are separate. There are 2 palatine bones, and those are pretty difficult to see from this view. You can see the little red part there, but the palatine bones are actually easier to see by looking at the skull from an inferior view, so looking up at it. We have a mandible in purple. The mandible is what we would call your lower jawbone. And here in blue we have a vomer, a single vomer that would go all the way back to where the nasal cavity ends. Some specific things about these bones. The maxillary bone is the keystone of the face, just like the sphenoid bone was the keystone of the cranium, because all of the other cranial bones attach to it. The maxillary is the keystone of the face because we can see just how many of these facial bones have a connection to the maxilla. They all do, except for the mandible, because the mandible attaches to the temporal bones. The maxilla forms the inferior part of the eye socket, so it does make up a substantial portion of where the eyeballs reside. The mandible has great importance. It is the only movable bone of your skull. So out of all 28 bones, only one of them is actually capable of moving. The rest of them are anchored in place by sutures that have developed over time. And because this bone is movable, it's the strongest bone. It does have muscles that pull on it, and that, of course, naturally makes bones strong. And it allows us to speak. It allows us to eat, which are very necessary functions. The eye orbits, or sometimes people call them eye sockets, are formed by 7 of the cranial and facial bones, so a combination of those, and they are listed here. These are your 2 eye orbits, and if you look, you can see the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, the zygomatic bone, the ethmoid bone on the inner side, the lacrimal bone just anterior to the ethmoid bone, the maxillary bone, and the palatine bone, which is really, really difficult to see in this picture, but very deep inside of there is a palatine bone. And then we have something called the nasal septum. A septum is a dividing wall. And so we have a couple of them in the body, but in terms of this one, the nasal septum is the structure that divides your nasal cavity in two. And it is actually more than just a bone. There are three things that come together to make up the nasal septum. First of all, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. This is actually a bone marking of the ethmoid bone. So it's not the entire ethmoid bone, but the ethmoid bone's perpendicular plate comes down from the ethmoid and in almost a T-shaped fashion divides the upper part of the nasal septum into two. So it gives you a left and a right. The vomer bone, which was one of our facial bones, rises up to meet the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and those two bones together form most of the wall that divides the nasal septum into a left and a right. And then there is cartilage here at the anterior part. That cartilage forms the remainder of the nasal septum wall. We also have, for bone markings, bony landmarks, something called a suture. A suture is a type of joint that will be discussed in the next chapter, in chapter 9. It is an immovable joint. The sutures are designed to effectively sew and adhere bones together so that they are not allowed to move independently of each other. There are four main sutures that we do talk about in the skull. The squamous suture is one of them. The word squamous means kind of flat without a really defined shape. And so this squamous suture here, you might remember the word squamous from chapter 4 when we talked about tissues. It's got that same kind of fried egg shape to it. And so the squamous suture joins the temporal bone to a parietal bone. So we would have a squamous suture on the left and a squamous suture on the right. And then we have the lambdoidal suture. The lambdoidal suture is the suture between the occipital bone and the two parietal bones. So it adheres those two together. The coronal, and it can also be called frontal suture, just like the coronal or frontal plane, combines the forehead bone, so the frontal bone, with the two parietal bones. So this suture here, and most of you can probably actually feel that suture if you press along your skull, joins those two bones. And then we have the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture, a sagittal plane, was a plane that divided the body into left and right. So in this case, the sagittal suture is between the two parietal bones. So it goes in the exact same direction of that plane. Before sutures actually finally harden, there actually are places where they are not even close to each other. Upon birth, we all have a division between where those sutures will end up going. And the reason for that is so going through the birth canal, the skull can actually be a little bit malleable and movable. We need to alleviate some of that pressure. And so allowing compression of the skull, allowing these bones to move slightly towards each other, does that. So a fontanelle is a place where a suture has not been completed yet, and we might call it a soft spot. If we look at the vertebrae, we see that there are these divisions, as was mentioned earlier. So we have cervical, there are 7 of those. These are the vertebrae of your neck. Thoracic, there are 12. Those are the vertebrae of your back, your upper back. Lumbar, there are 5. These would be what we would call the vertebrae of your lower back. And then we have the fused sacrum and the fused coccyx. Many people would like to call the coccyx the tailbone. One of the ways that you can remember these numbers is a little mnemonic that says you eat breakfast at 7, you eat lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. And that might help you remember the numbers of the vertebral division. Notice that this vertebrae has a good deal of curvature in it in multiple places. We actually aren't born with all of those curves at first. There are primary curves, curves that we have from birth, and then there are secondary curves that develop after we're born because certain things begin happening in the body. So our 2 primary curves are the curvatures that we get from both the thoracic and the sacral vertebrae. Your sacrum, even though those bones are fused, does have a curvature to it. So we already have these when we're born. We do not have the cervical or the lumbar curvature. We develop those as the muscles begin to pull on those vertebrae as they're needed. So as an infant around month 2, 3, 4 begins to learn to hold their head straight, doesn't really have to be held, that is when our neck muscles begin to work with those vertebrae, strengthen them, and we develop that curvature, that cervical curvature. The lumbar curvature develops as the child learns to walk. So as you begin to start crawling and then start trying to stand and then start trying to walk, you need to support more of your body weight. And so that originally flat lumbar spine begins to develop a curve in it because it's that curve that will help us to support the body weight. We do have 12 pairs of ribs, so the 7 pairs of true ribs have a direct attachment to the sternum. There are costal cartilages that attach from the rib to the sternum, and the costal cartilages of the true ribs, if you trace those down, they go straight from the sternum directly to a rib. That changes a little bit when we get to the 5 pairs of false ribs. 3 of them have an indirect attachment. It means their cartilage actually goes up to join with the cartilage of a true rib before it goes to the sternum. The last 2 pairs actually don't have cartilage at all when it comes to attaching to the sternum. There is no front anterior connection with the sternum. They're called floating ribs, which is a little bit of a misnomer because they're not completely free-floating. There is only one bone in your body that does not connect to another bone, and that is the hyoid bone. These 2 last pairs of false ribs, which are called floating ribs, they are attached to the thoracic vertebrae. So all 12 of your thoracic vertebrae do have a rib attached to them. But these last 2 go a little bit around towards the side, and they don't actually attach to the sternum, unlike the first 3 pairs of the false ribs. The sternum, your breastbone in other words, is made up of 3 pieces to it. It has a manubrium. It has a body. We learned that a body was the central portion of a bone. And it has a xiphoid process to it. And there are places where the ribs, the true ribs, would attach to the sternum. And then we can see here in this picture these false ribs, their cartilages go up here, they join with this cartilage, and then they go to the sternum.